no matter what sector you're in, there are probably lessons you can learn from other sectors that are dealing with a more magnified situation. So, you talk about, inventory or products that are coming in and out, no better place to look than the fast fashion, segment for how they manage that, because they're making high wire bets all the time, betting on something, getting it in, getting it out, selling it off, getting rid of that and redistributing that. On your bit about AI, that's a game changer. I mean, I think I don't think any of us, I don't really think any of us fully understands how big the deal this is going to be going forward, both positively and perhaps disruptively. But I think, positively is we're managing, so many different variables in a supply chain. This is going to help significantly manage that.
How do you get 10,000 people to take a step to the left? What's behind the relentless mindset of a world champion? Why do teams of exceptional talent fail? How do you manage the pressure to perform? These are just some of the curious questions we will attempt to answer as we bring you world leaders, curious minds, exceptional talent, successful CEOs, and incredible human beings who know how to inspire great leaders and are inspiring great leaders themselves. I am Craig Johns, high performance leadership expert, international speaker, and CEO of Speakers Institute Corporate and World Sport Coach. This is the Inspiring Great Leaders podcast, where the ordinary don't belong. Welcome to the Inspiring Great Leaders podcast. Our guest today is an advisor and strategist at EY-Parthenon and the author of the best-selling book, Cash is King. Working across a variety of sectors such as automotive, aerospace, defense, healthcare, retail, and consumer products, he advises business leaders on how to optimize the management of cash. With a Bachelor of Science in Economics from Purdue University, his career has included principal at EL Consultancy Group and is currently the America's EY-Parthenon Working Capital Leader at Ernst Young. I have the pleasure of introducing you to an inspirational leader who is committed to results, unlocking cash, and strengthening balance sheets, and has a love of skiing and hiking. Peter Kingma. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Craig. Great to be here.
Beautiful. So you're over there in the wonderful Chicago, on the other side of the world to where I am. I'm really curious, where did you grow up and what was the big dream running around the playground?
So I grew up in Indiana, which is not far from Chicago, about 2 hours from here. I wanted to be an architect. And I'm a frustrated architect these days. I probably subscribe to every single architectural publication and have books and the like. Quick story. We had in our small town, some family friends were all getting together to restore a theater. And the lead architect in the project knew that I was interested in architecture. The blueprints were in terrible shape. And so he needed somebody to go redraw them. So literally measure a line here, draw a line there. And so I spent my whole summer, while everyone else was out having fun, I spent my whole summer in high school redrawing blueprints. And that's when I decided finance might actually be a better career for me than architecture.
From an architecture point of view, was it just the beauty of buildings or the design of things? What caught your attention before you realized numbers might be a better pathway?
Oh, it is. Yeah. The beauty of buildings. I just think it's such a fascinating form of art, right? Because it's livable. We all use it. We live in them, we work in them, interact with them. So I love how buildings come together.
Yeah, great. And I'm sure you've traveled around the world. So is there any one particular architecture that just blows your mind in the way that it's been designed or the beauty of it, that's something that sits with you?
Well, fortunately, I don't have to go very far. I think my city of Chicago has some of the absolute best architecture in the world. And I love the combination, of different eras and styles. Yes, and people in Chicago take it very seriously. We take our architecture quite seriously. So I'm surrounded by beauty every day.
Yeah, so you're in a big position now at EY-Parthenon and leading a number of people and working with a lot of companies. But I'm curious, when you were younger in your teenage years, were you more of a leader or follower?
Probably both. I mean, I volunteered for everything. I was in a program in the States called Junior Achievement. I'm not sure if that's outside of the States. I think it may be just in the States. But we formed in high school. We formed these little businesses, and we had sponsors. Companies would sponsor us and make a product. Our product was aluminum coat hangers, and we would sell them. But it was really, it taught us all aspects of it. We had to raise capital, sell stock, sell the product, do all the accounting. So a really fun, hands-on sort of opportunity to get into a business. I loved that. I thought it was fun. I'm very much of an extrovert, so I love to be part of teams and be with people. And that's why COVID was so hard on me and so many of us. We had to work by ourselves.
Yeah, I bet. So we've it seems to pop up every decade or so where we have what is either a recession or depression, or there's economic uncertainty that occurs. Some people may say it's a bit more regular now, but the big ones tend to hit around every decade. Why do we see these things happen? What's going on that we seem to see a repetitive nature of the same things coming up?
Well, if I knew the answer to that, I probably would be retired by now. But what I can tell you is, we are going through unprecedented, geopolitical shocks. Again, we went through this in COVID when the supply chain was, globally was shut down for big portions of the time. Now we see, with crises in the Middle East, in Europe, in Asia, it's pretty significant. And the one thing I'll say, and this is what kind of I talk about in my book, and what I would like hopefully we can explore in this conversation, is it's so critically important to maintain liquidity and capital, because the one thing that is certain about business is that it is uncertain, and there will be times where we're in troubled situations, or it could be the positive, the lack of the positive, right? There could be an opportunity to pounce on your competition, or to take advantage of some new trend or emerging, market, and that requires liquidity and capital to be able to respond to that. And far too often, I think we as business people get so focused just on revenue and perhaps even on profitability, and we forget the fundamentals of cash. And and that's what really keeps everything going is cash.
Yeah, and the ability to build reserves. I always find it interesting where you watch a lot of companies and they can turn over great profit revenues coming through, but they're spending it just as fast as they're getting it, or they're putting it into places where they can't, as you say, can't tap into it. And I'm always, for us, I remember coming into COVID, and I was already working with a company that had reserves, but at the beginning of COVID, I spent time with them to ensure we built greater reserves before I left there, just to say, hey, look, we're okay right now, but something else may happen. So let's make sure we strengthen that position so that when, if we do end up in a situation where we do need some, it is sitting there and we're not then worried about trying to go to banks and trying to get loans and trying to find capital somewhere else. But also starting a new business during COVID too, where, it could have been quite easy because we were doing really, really well at the beginning. We had great trajectory to actually, take some of those reserves out and apply it somewhere else. But I made the step straight away and I said, no, we're building reserves, because you just don't know what's going to happen. And we ended up having quite a big risk element to that business, which then required us to use the reserves for a while. It's not now. We're back in a great position again. But it was interesting, like I sort of sit back and go, how many new businesses are not even thinking about that cash flow and building things like that, let alone very established companies. So from your experience, how many companies are making smart decisions around their cash flow?
Well, Not a lot, or I should say, there's a great deal of room for improvement. Let me, Craig, if you will, let me tell you a kind of a funny story, or sort of a throwback to when I was just out of college, and then I'll kind of on the sort of a lesson that I learned about managing cash, and then I'll bring it forward and maybe use some examples for what's happening currently. But those days right out of college, I was living paycheck to paycheck, right? So and fortunately though, I knew when I was going to get paid. So I knew I was paid on the 1st and the 15th. And I fortunately didn't have a landlord that would knock on my door and demand rent whenever he wanted. I knew when rent was due. I knew when the bills were due. And so I understood the cycle of managing cash flow, and I could manage my budget accordingly. Now, the days leading up to paydays, I refer to those as my tuna days, because about all I could afford was, canned tuna fish. So I was eating like a house cat. But I was able to endure that because I knew cash was going to come in. And so I think as households, we understand that. We understand with household budgets that it's the timing of the flow of cash coming in and going out that we have to manage. Somehow then we get into business and we complicate it and we forget that. And so we chase revenue and we congratulate ourselves with making, great sales and great revenue. But if we haven't collected that, if people owe us that cash and haven't paid it to us, then we don't have the liquidity to pay our bills or to reinvest in the business. And so this is where I've just been fascinated by professional career that, even sophisticated business leaders sometimes forget those fundamentals that we learn, in our own households. For example, you have to pay taxes on revenue. And if you don't have the cash in hand, if somebody's still owing it, you still have to pay the taxes on that revenue. So to magnify that, and I think, one of the things I'll also talk about in this chat with you today is that I think, in most business organizations, individuals, the employees of the companies, they kind of understand the role they play in sales or revenue development, and they kind of understand the role they play in cost containment or profitability. But they make countless decisions every day by, and magnified, it's a big organization, thousands of people that can positively or negatively encumber cash. And we don't give them the tools. We don't give them the understanding of the trade-offs of those decisions. So I think, particularly at a time like this with interest rates globally that are creeping up and instability that, every day we open the paper and see something new, I think, organizations are going to be very wise to examine their management of liquidity and cash.
Mm. So when there's uncertainty, that often leads to overwhelm as well. So let's, we'll separate two things here. One, we've got, a whole lot of leaders that are dealing, and employees as well, that are dealing with a lot of uncertainty and overwhelm. And then obviously we've got the cash flow aspect. So let's look at the uncertainty and overwhelm. When companies or people are, leaders are facing that overwhelm and uncertainty, what can they do to ensure that overwhelm is reduced, or can't say even negated, but reduced and minimalized for both themselves and the people inside the organization?
Well, I think transparency, first of all, is going to be critical. And I think, and I'm going to go back to my, I'll keep harping back a little bit to some of what I do for a living, because I think if you examine the way a company manages its capital, that's a great barometer for the sophistication of business processes. So, let me give you one other example. To the extent that you have an organization with a lot of people doing collections, that represents process failure, right? Because in an ideal world, everybody would, you bill correctly and you'd get paid correctly. But, to the extent that you have to spend money doing that, now there will always be deadbeat customers, but to the extent that you're spending money on that means that there's internal process failures. And so, in a sort of uncertain environment like this, every one of those business processes that are, maybe you've got forecast error, you don't fully understand the cost to serve of your customer base, you don't fully understand the vulnerability of your supply chain. all of those things get magnified in this uncertain time. So as leaders, I think it's very important that we, that we see the warning signs and that we investigate those processes and really tear those apart to try and get optimal performance. What I'd love to see is, that you're really in business to generate capital. You're really in business to generate cash. So I love to measure how efficient you are, or how effective you are rather, and how efficient you are. So how much cash can you spin off of your business and capital can you create, and how much does it cost you to do that, or how efficient are you at doing that? Because that will go a long way to sort of solving some of these, or being able to solve some of these business crises that we may be going through.
Yeah. Okay. So to really, really help people, really differentiate between, say, a cash culture versus a profit and loss culture, what are the key things they need to be focusing on here to ensure that they shift the way the business is focused?
Yeah, I think the first thing is, as leaders, is we've got to understand who has the decision rights, and help them understand their impact on it. So let me give you a couple examples. Let's say I'm a salesperson and I'm very excited about making a big sale, and I get down to the end of the deal, and now suddenly I'm being asked to take 120-day payment terms, from the customer, or I'm being asked to certain service level requirements, or maybe even certain features and functions that are going to be customizable. If I haven't baked that into the economic equation of the deal early on and negotiated that, I'm kind of stuck at the end. And gosh, that happens so often. So often those commercial agreements and terms are, kind of at the end and forgotten, and they're negotiated. And particularly if I've got a sales organization where their commission is based on revenue, not on collected revenue, then I've got a whole group that's not even incented in the first place to care about it, right? They're caring about getting that big revenue, regardless of how long it may take to get paid on that. So, and you could apply the same sort of lesson in, say, procurement. If I'm a procurement organization or folks that work in procurement, and I'm incented to get the lowest possible cost for material that I'm trying to buy, and I source it from halfway across the globe, then I may be taking on a minimum order quantity requirements that are bigger. I may have transportation costs that are greater. I may have lead times that are significantly greater. And if I don't have the calculation of the tools to sort of bake all that in, or if I'm not being held accountable for that aspect of it, then I may be making decisions that are counterproductive. And so again, I work with very, very big companies, and I see this magnified, significantly in the C-suite. They fully understand the importance of capital and cash, but all these decisions are being scattered about the organization. So the first thing as leaders we've got to do is get a grip on who is making those decisions, and get them trained, get them the tools and the resources they need so that they can make the right trade-off decisions.
Yeah, it's a good point, right? So who's making those decisions that leads to it? And you're talking about there when you're dealing with, say, companies that may have up to 120-day payment terms. And if you're a smaller business and you're dealing with one of these bigger companies that's kind of going, well, this is our policy, it can be a bit of a challenge too for some of those smaller businesses, and not even small business, some of the big businesses where they may have a lot of outgoings before they even receive the money coming in. And that ability to really be able to project and oversee the cash flow management, I think, is really important. I know we're always monitoring our cash flow on a weekly basis, and sitting down and with the finance team and going, okay, cool, here's our new programs, here's our new services coming in, here's the agreements. All right, we need to project these in. Okay, how does the cash flow look? Where might we face some bottlenecks? Okay, what can we do about that? Can we maybe renegotiate some of the terms, or do we need to look at some other cash flow options where we can drive cash instantly rather than having to wait that long period of time? So it can be a bit of a challenge. I know that we negotiate a lot now where we're like, okay, well, if you want us to deliver, then before we even we need to have 50% upfront to confirm that we're going to be delivering this, and then 50% upon delivery. And so really trying to think about how do we set this up so that it's a smart way for business.
Super smart. And maybe I'll offer two ideas, Craig, on that point. One is, to fully understand your negotiating strength in these discussions, whether you're buying or selling, right? And so if you're a small business and you're buying from a big business, and I talk about this in the book, is sort of the polarity of your your influence. But if you're a small business and you're selling to a big business and they say, take it or leave it, this is our payment terms, then you need to do everything you can possibly do to control everything on your end of that relationship. So if that means getting a bill out on time to the right place that is accurate, if there's a purchase order number that has to be referenced, everything you could do. And a great quick way to calculate this, whether you're a big business or small business, but a very quick way to calculate whether or not you're doing that is to calculate your best possible days to collect. So that's go through your agreements. And if, you've got 45 days here and 60 days here, whatever they are, if you calculate that, if everyone were to pay you on time, what would that look like? And then if you compare Premier up to yourself and say, all right, now, but here's what I'm actually getting in the door, that delta represents your failure rate. Now, like we said, there could be some deadbeats customers in there as well, but that's also a failure rate because that means that you need to weed them out. You need to stop selling to them or stop servicing them. If they're not paying you, they're not really customers. So that would be one idea. The other is, I think it's so important to understand the cost to serve your customer base. Again, whether you're a big company or small company, because not all customers are equal. And you want, particularly when you're making decisions that tie up capital or that require you to invest capital in that relationship, you want to be able to make a proactive decision, something that's going to pay back. Craig, every dollar that we invest in our business costs the same, but has a different rate of return. And so I want to have the highest rates of return, and I want to understand fully, what it costs to serve these customers. So if I've got customers that have, very unusual contract language that I've got to live up to, or service level requirements or delivery requirements, whatever they may be, I need to fully understand what that cost is so that I can then decide whether or not, this is where I really want to tie up my capital. Is it worth it or not?
Yeah, I like that. We always look at, our different product lines and think about, which ones have higher profit margins, which one a little bit lower profit margins. But we, pretty much have a formula in place that we try to stick to where possible to make sure that, we've got that right buffer zone so we can, if there is a bad debt or is there a delay, is there, some of the costs to deliver have gone up through inflation or interest rates so that we can cater for that. There's always that buffer zone there. And, I think, what's your perspective on trying to spread, obviously we always want the highest profit margin we possibly can, but that's not always possible. And so is it about just trying to spread your bets in a way across the different types of products and services and profit margin, or should we be trying to focus a lot more in a certain area of profit margin of profitability? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it really depends. So let's talk about a manufacturing company that maybe has products, as you mentioned. I think one is understanding the demand for that and the demand curve, right? So very few products have a constant demand curve, right? They're either ascending or descending or some version of that. And so, forecasting out based on where we're at in the demand curve is important. A lot of companies get into the trap of once they introduce a new stock keeping unit SKU, so some aspect of a product, it's very hard for them to retire that. And so then they keep maintaining that at the same service level and offering that. And so then you start to see this non-productive inventory creep into the system, into the equation. And so really important to actively manage your portfolio. But I would say the same thing goes for actively managing your portfolio of your customer relations too. I think what I find is that, most organizations kind of follow a Pareto distribution, which is 80% or 20% of your customers are likely contributing 80% of your profitability, and the remaining 80% are contributing 20%. So, and same probably is true for your products as well. But understanding that distribution and the cost curves and the life curve is very important. And again, and I do talk about this in the book. I offer some examples of how to calculate that, how to do that. It's not very complicated. It's just that sometimes we get into fire drills in businesses, and we just keep going from one fire drill to another fire drill, and we don't take the time to stop and analyze this. And gosh, procurement organizations are maybe the most stressed, right? Because those are the ones that I describe them as being air traffic controllers. They're trying to source products. They don't want to shut production lines down. They're trying to get the cheapest price. And so to ask them to stop and consider, sourcing strategies and commercial terms, it's often very difficult. So we got to give, as leaders, we've got to give folks that are in day-to-day operations enough time and space and tools and training to be able to help make some of those trade-offs.
Yeah. We're seeing a lot, obviously the advent of regenerative AI and lots of different technology tools that are coming into play. It's interesting when you think about from kind of this perspective, is that it's changing so fast. So obviously the lifetime of a product or a service in a way in that space is in many cases getting shorter. I'm sure there are some that still have a long lifespan, but in many cases we're seeing shorter lifespans. So really being able to predict or understand cash flow over a long period of time could be pretty challenging, especially if you're dealing with certain technologies that require hardware.
Yeah, and I think I think there's a lot of lessons you can, no matter what sector you're in, there are probably lessons you can learn from other sectors that are dealing with a more magnified situation. So, you talk about, inventory or products that are coming in and out. No better place to look than the fast fashion, segment for how they manage that, because they're making high wire bets all the time, betting on something, getting it in, getting it out, selling it off, getting rid of that and redistributing that. On your bit about AI, that's a game changer. I mean, I think I don't think any of us, I don't really think any of us fully understands how big a deal this is going to be going forward, both positively and perhaps disruptively. But I think, positively is we're managing, so many different variables in a supply chain. This is going to help significantly manage that. Or so many different variables of, credit risks or worthiness of your customers, contract language. I bet most medium-sized and big-size organizations, if you tried to audit, do they fully understand everything that's in their contracts today with their customers? I bet the answer is no. I mean, there's some good contract management tools out there, but that's an area that's just ripe for AI to come in and help streamline that and make a lot, de-risk a lot of those situations.
Yeah. In regards to, you're talking about customer service or even sales management there a little bit. What other components of that management is required to ensure that we get really strong cash flow? How can we shift the way people think in regards to customer relationships or sales management?
Well, so I talk about in the book a concept. If you're a medium size or big size, it probably doesn't apply to a small organization, but a medium size or big size organization, creating something called a cash leadership office. And listen, I'm leery of consultant speak, and I'm leery of yet another project management office or PMO. But I think it's worth exploring. And the reason for that is, again, we have set up most organizations, we have structured them around the P&L. And so most organizations, even the way we report, the way we conduct business process reviews, it's largely around the P&L. And so if we want to create a cash culture where we want to, fully help the folks in our organizations fully understand, the impact they have every day on either consuming or generating cash, then we need to do something extraordinary. We need to have a structure in place to go through, and I kind of describe this a little bit like zero-based budgeting. And I know that some people some people hate that concept, some people love it. But if we're going to generate a cash culture, then we got to get out of just the, hey, could I improve my collections by 5%, or could I hold just a little bit less inventory? I think you got to flip it on its head, and you got to ask, what capital am I going to need in the business going forward? What are the scenario plans? What if this crisis, continues on? What if I lose my biggest customer? What if my biggest supplier is, can't supply to me anymore? What kind of additional capital, and what's that capital range that I'm going to need? And then going back and looking at the business itself, like, how am I generating that capital? So what am I going to have to do differently? Because the capital that you generate, the cash that you generate in your business, will always be the cheapest form of cash and liquidity that you can access. And so I guess, maybe the way to answer that question is I really think we've got to acknowledge that we haven't done a good job of putting cash on an equity playing field with P&L, with revenue and profit. And we've got to somehow do that and give the tools and insight and everything to the organization to be able to manage that.
I'm talking about cash flow leader in that space. I think that's really important because it could be quite easy and I'm sure many companies allow this to happen. Maybe not consciously sometimes, but it kind of just happens where just small little things add up, right? And so that ability to have someone who's monitoring even not just the big macro areas that we could be looking after our cash flow better, but also those micro things that add up pretty fast. We might 5 days delayed here doesn't seem like much, but you start multiplying that by 100 different suppliers or even 10 different suppliers, that can have a huge impact on capital and cash flow availability through in the business.
And it's could even be about how to take advantage. I worked with a client. This is a consumer product company, and what they wanted to turn the question around of how they do fulfillment and logistics. And it was assumed that was a cost to them, that, as they're distributing their products to grocers and, retailers and the like. They wanted to turn that around and ask the question, how could this actually be a liquidity generator for us? How could we do this differently and provide enhanced services, that are different insights that we can provide our customer base? And that's the kind of creative thinking, that I'm talking about, that, you want to economize wherever possible, but you also want to turn the question around and figure out how I could use this capital more effectively. And so that's really tearing into your, investment thesis around R&D, around, how you're measuring. I see all the time companies, going through lots and lots of work to make it an investment decision, and then they don't monitor it then going forward. They don't see, a year out, 2 years out, did it actually return what we said it was going to return? Did it do it on a schedule? Are we able to pull the plug if it's not doing that? They do that with high profile things, but the mundane, everyday sort of investment decisions, they don't do that. And so I think, again, it gets into that creating a separate structure. Now I would advise, I'm a big believer that something like that should be sunsetted, because I don't think the whole point of this is to try and get the organization to start thinking differently and to, change your business operating models to include these considerations. So, whether you can do it in 3 years or 7 years or what, it's probably going to take multiple years. But I do think it's a good idea to start that sort of initiative with a sunset in mind, so that you really bake that into the operating process of the company.
Okay, and I'll just pick up every now and then if there's a term that may be outside of general people's thinking. So do you want to explain sunsetting for those who don't quite understand on the podcast?
Sure. You should it should go out of business. You should end the cash leadership office. Like if you establish it, it probably will need to be in existence for 2 or 3 years, but ultimately you don't want a separate organization going forward. You want to take all of the sort of the process that you've uncovered, the new ways of thinking, and really build those into everyday business management operating processes. So if you have an ops review, incorporating that into your ops review process, because I think again, the goal here is that we want to get visibility and tools to people to be able to make informed decisions about either the generation or the consumption of cash, and so they can do that with the right tools and the right insight.
Okay. And talking about here earlier on around negotiating terms or trying to ensure that we can ensure that we've got the best possible deal when receiving money back from suppliers or customers, etc. What we're finding in our industry is that we're seeing more and more requests right now for navigating difficult conversations. People, when it comes to a feeling of there might be tension or there might be a little bit of conflict, or that they just don't want to avoid it. Like they feel, okay, it could happen, they want to avoid it. And so when you're thinking about going into those conversations, and obviously you need to be as proactive as possible when it comes to thinking about cash flow and the terms and agreements that go into contracts. What are some really good tips from your perspective in regards to approaching situations where, say someone is coming in and going, our terms are 120 days. And you're sitting there going, look, we're happy with 30. And so what are some tips then, way they can navigate through those situations where they feel a bit uncomfortable, maybe there might be tension, and how can they go into that conversation?
Yeah, again, I think let's talk about the customer side of it, and then we'll talk about the supply side of this. We'll start off with the customer side of it. Again, really understanding what your bargaining position is, right? If you are selling into a big organization where that's their standard set of terms and conditions, and you're not like some super important strategic supplier to them, it will be very difficult for you to do that. Now, you can also explore many larger organizations will have supply chain financing options that you can look at. That comes with a cost, but that there are options for that that might lessen the impact of that delay. But there again, also don't underestimate the importance of the appeal to them, because this is not a zero-sum game. And I flip that around when we're talking about our supply base that we're dealing with. It's not about just squeezing them so hard that all of a sudden our suppliers now are going out of business, but being very candid and upfront with your customers about, here's my cash situation. And if they are, if they're truly interested in cultivating that relationship with you, then, be upfront with them. And like, I can't float 120 days and provide you the same kind of service levels that you're asking for. Something's got to give. I've got to pay, and I won't have the cash to pay it. To pay for materials, to pay for employees, to pay for research and development, all the things that you like about what I'm offering to you. And it could be for a service business, right? I've got to fund payrolls. So I would, don't underestimate the impact that you can have in those discussions, and be prepared to do that. And like I said, with the supply side, on a regular basis, you need to evaluate the concentration of your supply. If there's an opportunity to concentrate some supply relationships and be able to then take that and negotiate for a better position, whether it's better cost position or a better, payment, extending the payment a bit to give you some more room, that's pretty valuable. Now, it's also important to understand risk, right? So if you don't want to over concentrate and then end up with just one supplier that puts you in great risk. But regular reviews of that sort of thing are critically important.
Now, with geopolitical uncertainty, also a bit of, and obviously comes with that is economic uncertainty at the same time. Talking about supply chains, What are some key areas or key things we need to be considering when we're thinking about supply chains in regards to ensuring that, hey, look, we might be delayed. Obviously during COVID, for instance, it was taking, up to 2 years to receive a car type of thing. So what can we do in regards to ensuring we still have a healthy cash flow when supply chains are being put under the pump?
You've got to understand the extended supply chain, right? So it's not good enough to understand your direct supplier, but who is supplying that supplier, right? Because that really will give you, particularly for not everything needs to be done that way, right? It's, again, segment this, and for the stuff that's critically important, right? There's other stuff where you can have substitution, you can easily get it. Maybe it's going to cost a little bit more transportation or cost to change. But if you've got a supplier that it's going to be very difficult to replace, understand the health that they've got as well. So they may be sourcing from unstable markets or businesses that are not healthy as well. So you need to sort of understand that risk profile. I think increasingly, Craig, we also see, and I think this term is a globally understood term, but ESG, environmental, social, governmental impact. So, there are some locations and some companies, particularly more locations, where we don't necessarily want to be associated with them. And so we've got to be careful to understand that if we're sourcing from somewhere and then they're sourcing from, say, a market that might be, caught up in a political, they're political pariah, there's issues going on in that region. Understand that, because that will have an impact not only just on the stability of our supply chain, but also on our reputation as well. And in this environment where nothing, in this digital environment where nothing goes away and everything is searchable, reputation, once you lose it, is very, very difficult to get back.
Something we saw, obviously this is not going to be appropriate for every business, but, we saw I live in Australia at the moment, and during COVID, we started to see a lot of companies shift to trying to keep as much of their supply chain, if not all of it, inside Australia. And so so it's actually been quite good on many sense. One, it's starting to ensure that the cash flow remains more in the country of origin in a way. There's also the environmental components to it, because we're not shipping it overseas or flying it across the world or whatever it may be. And so there were some really, really good, I suppose, not byproducts, but there were some great benefits that came out of that situation we face. And we're potentially going to see it again right now with obviously all the challenges we're facing in Europe, in Middle East, parts of the world, and Asia as well, where, we're going to see people start to think a bit more locally. And that's obviously got to be better for the environment, hopefully, in many cases. Is that something you're seeing also in America and other parts of the world, that people are starting to look a little bit closer to home?
Very much so. And I think consumers are responding to that as well. I did work for an apparel company in the States, and they were sourcing much of their products from Asia and from markets that were kind of not known for having really great labor practices. And we then helped sort of show them alternative markets closer in. So in this particular case, it was Mexico. It came with higher cost, but the social benefit that they got out of that greatly outweighed that, and the reputational benefit that they got was worth it. So I think we're seeing that a lot now. There is a dangerous slippery side to that, right? If it gets to be so nationalistic, and closed borders, and we're only going to support certain industries, you'll start to see the costs drive up. We're seeing that in certain sectors, certain commodities in the U.S. right now. That we saw that with steel, with tariffs, for example. And if there's a lot now new buzz and discussion around mergers, cross-border mergers in that sector. That is going to drive up. It's going to drive up consumer prices. It's going to drive up component prices. I hear you, And I agree that there are some good aspects to more localized sourcing, particularly if it has an environmental impact or has a reputational or consumer impact. But there's also a flip side to that where you may end up, causing greater economic harm and drive inflation higher, drive up costs needlessly.
Yeah. If we're from a leadership perspective, we're looking at creating a culture throughout the entire company around how can we be more cash flow efficient and effective. What are some of the things that we need to apply throughout the organization that we haven't covered already that you feel are really important?
Yeah, I think people get into this trap of thinking cash is free or capital is free. So people in different parts of the organization will want to make an investment. They want to expand. They want to hire, whatever it might be. And I don't think people fully understand, the concept of, say, weighted average cost of capital, and that it's not just based on debt rates. It's based on you've got to factor in the amount of debt you have. So not just the access to, say, overnight financing rates, but how much debt you already have and what you're able to take on, so your debt service. But then also, your cost of your equity as well. And so we need to do a better job in particularly the finance leadership needs to do a better job explaining that and laying that out. Now, I should have said at the outset, Craig, that my book is not a textbook. I created a fictitious company. And so every chapter, the officers are trying to solve a problem. And I did this on purpose because I wanted this to be something that's very accessible so that anybody in an organization can read this and get understand some of these concepts. But I go into some rather complicated things like weighted average cost of capital or absorption rate, absorption costing, and try and do it in a way so that, everybody who's not just the finance leadership team understands these concepts. And I think whether this book accomplishes all of that, I don't know, but that's the hope that I have, that organizations will start to engage with their employees and their stakeholders in a way that they can, explain these concepts and explain, things like cost of capital and debt and how important that is for people to keep an eye on.
Mm-hmm. So if we summarize up, and I love the way you're approaching the book too, which is, I think, fantastic. But if we were to summarize up into, say, 3 key macro things that companies need to look at right now to check how effective they are from cash flow management, what would you say are those 3 key things?
Well, again, I think, number one is you have people making decisions on your behalf all the time. So we talk about, a capital approval process. Most companies have a very formalized capital approval process. If you want to spend $1 million or whatever it might be, and it's got to go through multiple layers. But you could have a salesperson out there making 1 or 2 times that kind of cash impact just with the way they're structuring a sales deal, maybe and not going through reviews. So, number one is, get a grip on understanding who has the decision rights, positively or negatively. Number 2 is you got to spend some money to train people. I think we are so bad that most businesses are so bad about investing in that training and just assuming that, hey, we can have a broadcast and somehow everyone's going to understand their role in that. But I think, that's maybe where the cash leadership office comes in as well. And then lastly, aligning metrics and compensation accordingly. What we compensate for gets done, and what we measure gets done. What I see though is too often we overload organizations with too many metrics and we confuse the heck out of everybody, or we have metrics and compensations that have unintended consequences. I talked about like the sales. Compensate your salespeople based on collected revenue. Then all of a sudden they're going to be a lot more interested in those commercial terms that they may be just giving away. So I'd say number 1, understand who has decision rights and get a handle on that. Number 2, be prepared to train your organization, communicate with them, bring them along in this journey. And then number 3, align your metrics and your compensation to support that.
Yeah. Okay. I like those approaches too. Really, really important, to go through, and you're not bulletproofing your organizations, but you're less setting it up to minimize the risks of, something big happening, which may require you to have cash flow on hand or capital available. And if you don't have that set up, then it puts you in some pretty challenging times. And what we generally tend to see around the world is the first things that get hit are, let's make a whole lot of people redundant, which is not smart, because you've literally got to you lose all your history, you got to rebuild again. And so what you're talking about here is really relevant, and I think it would provide a lot more stability and long-term profitability for organizations by being smarter around the way that we set up that cash flow, rather than having to react based on small decisions or lack of decisions in regards to the way that we collect cash and also utilize it.
And Craig, I can offer, I've got concrete proof of this. So I had co-authored a study at Ernst Young last year where we assessed, I think it was 1,000 global companies, and looked at their performance, or their cash performance. And those that were in the top quartile, we were able to demonstrate quantitatively how much faster they were able to come out of a downturn and respond to that, how much fewer of them went into the downturn in the first place. I mean, it's intuitive, right? If I go way back to that crazy story about me right out of college, if I had a rainy day fund and, I got a flat tire, I could afford to fix my flat tire, right? So the same applies to business, right? If we may have a lot of revenue, but if we don't have access to that, or if a lot of our capital is tied up in material that's just not selling, then come the rainy day, we're not able to respond to it as quickly and as agilely as our competition is.
Very, very good. We all know smart people have great answers, but the most successful people ask great questions. When was the last time you did something for the first time?
That's a fantastic question. Something for the first time, okay, so over COVID, I tried to teach myself how to cook. Maybe, and I probably put on too many pounds, so now I'm trying to teach myself how to undo that. I set out to try and do different nationalities. I was doing Korean and Vietnamese, and really getting into that. I had the time and the ability to do that. So that was certainly fun.
I like that one. We definitely haven't had that one come up before. What is the one question that you would love to solve?
Oh, well, maybe international peace. I don't know. I mean, listen, I have been doing this work for the past 20 or 30 years because I love it. I love that I can measure the results of what I do. It's not just a nice to have. I think I've estimated that personally I've helped generate 25 billion of value creation for my clients, and I'm proud of that, because to your point, these are real jobs, right? These are iconic companies that employ people, so they are now far more resilient, far more stable because of that. Growing, thriving organizations, full of families, full of people who get a paycheck because of that. So I love that part of what I do.
Brilliant. For you, what is an inspiring great leader, and who is a great example of this for you?
Well, my dad is he's no longer with us, but he was my hero. I mean, he was a small town banker, and his word was gold. Always lived up to any commitment that he ever put out there, volunteered for everything in the community. We had 6 kids, or there were 6 kids in our family. Somehow he found a way to get us all through college. So I'd put my mom, equally up there. But as a business person, I'd put my dad as probably, and he he traded a lot. He could have gone off and done a lot of other things and made a lot more money. But his focus was on his small community and being a leader in the small community and growing and building his family. I just think that's terrific.
Yeah, good. I'm going to throw in a bonus question here. Is what do you foresee in the next 5 years is going to be absolutely critical for leaders of companies to get right?
Cash. No, listen, I think in the next 5 years, we haven't even begun to see some of the disruption in supply chain. And I think that's going to be I think there's going to be a lot of companies that are going to make it or break it based on that. You're also seeing the cyclical nature. We've had overnight changing consumer behavior, consumer demand. So, it used to be, like in retail, you go out to a store, you were responsible for the last mile of delivery of whatever you bought, as a consumer. Now I want to order one bottle of soap. I do it on my phone and I want it to be here over the next day. That requires wholesale change in the way we distribute products. There's a shifting consumer tastes for more specialty products. So if I'm a food company and my old way of doing it is run machines 24/7 and make as much of that whatever product that I put in a box and put it in the middle of a grocery aisle. Now I want healthier choices. I want, more bespoke. I want it, I want it to arrive at my door. All of those things are rapidly shifting. And then you magnify that with everything that's happening globally. I just think this is where, again, not to be a broken record, but where capital and liquidity is going to be essential now more than ever going into what I think is going to be a rather, shifting and turbulent next 5 years.
Beautiful. It's been a wonderful conversation, Peter. How can people learn more about what you do and what is the best way for people to connect with you?
Yep. So I have a website, peterkingma.com. And on that website, you can also, I've got all of the, different articles I've written for publications, interviews similar to this are there. So there's more resource if you're interested in that. Links to the book. The book is called Cash is King. Links to the book where you can order that. As well as out there. But, and then, you can also, send me an email if you like at that address, and be happy to get back in touch with you.
Yeah, wonderful. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you today, Peter. I love this approach to really get people to think a little bit more micro and a bit more detailed around, how they look at the way they purchase stuff, how they work with their consumers and their suppliers, how they ensure that they understand not only the risk that they have available, but also be in a position to therefore fund the risk if required and have things available on hand to deal with the challenges that we can face, whether it be supply chain, whether it be procurement, whether it be consumer demand, and how do we navigate those situations without affecting the human being. And I think a lot of the times we forget there's human beings involved. And if we can set up our businesses in a way that protects the human being from mistakes that could be mitigated and through ensuring that we have cash flow available, whether that, and also capital available to be able to use when it's required rather than sitting there going, how do we do this? And so thank you very much for your time. And for those out there, make sure you check out Cash is King in all good bookstores, and we'll pop those links in the show notes to ensure that you can connect through to Peter, find out more information, and ensure that your business is cash flow effective rather than potentially in a position of vulnerability. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Craig. And I have to say, some of the best questions I've been asked in quite a long time. So thank you for that. Great conversation.
It's time for you to join the Inspiring Great Leaders movement by visiting craigjohns.com.au. Share this podcast on LinkedIn and be sure to hashtag Inspiring Great Leaders. We would love it if you could leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Drop us a line with your feedback and questions and connect with us on the Craig Johns LinkedIn, Facebook and Instagram pages. Be sure to check out the next Inspiring Great Leaders podcast, where the ordinary don't belong.